In this section, we'll focus on the iteration itself. So we're not going to talk much about what happens before or after. We'll focus on the key components of a Scrum iteration. So one of the key things that it starts from is the sprint planning. Usually it has two parts in it. We'll talk about it. The output is a sprint backlog. We'll talk about what it contains. And then you move into the sprint execution, which is the entire length of the sprint, where on a daily basis you have the daily scrum or daily stand-up meetings, and finally at the end of the sprint there is a output, a potentially shippable increment, which is presented during the review, and also the sprint retrospective, where the team come together and discuss what went right and what went wrong and what can be improved in further future sprints. Sprint planning is broken down into sprint planning 1 and sprint planning 2. And the part 1 is attended by the product owner, in which the focus is in what are the items that would be done in the upcoming sprint. And generally, depending on the velocity of the team, a certain number of product backlog stories are pulled in and discussed to understand what was in the mind of the product owner when he wrote down those. Now, sprint planning 2 is actually without the product owner's presence, and most of the discussion is around how will the team approach the task at hand, and in ensuring that it can be done. Usually it involves breaking down the user stories into task level, identifying who will probably be doing what, and so forth, including looking at things like whether it's doable, can we commit on it, do we have enough capacity, etc. And then once it's finalized, they commit to it and work on completing it. During the sprint planning part 2, even though the product owner is not present during the meeting, he needs to be around so that if the team has certain questions, certain doubts, they can reach out and clarify it, or have a negotiation about probably replacing certain parts if there are too many uncertainties on it, and so forth. So generally the inputs are the product backlog items, the velocity, probably it could also include certain learnings from the retrospective of the last sprint, and constraints if any. And the outputs are the product backlog items, the sprint backlog item rather, and the commitment on doing it. So let's say you're getting started after the sprint planning with the sprint execution, and what are the things that you need to do? Well, one of the first element of Scrum would be to create a Scrum board. It's basically a visual radiator which kind of shows the different tasks and what stage they are in. The different lanes in the Scrum board needs to be defined, like to do, in progress, done. There might be other lanes added appropriately, like testing or design, depends on the team and how they want to go about it. But generally, at least the basic would be to do, progress, and done. And before that is the list of or the lane that represents all the sprint backlog items. You may define the shop floor according to the needs of the team and according to the done state. So that done state has to be defined with the product owner, and depending on what needs to be done in defining a complete done state, that would affect the different lanes that you may add. You need to have the ID, task name, estimate can be posted, and that's how you go about to start the to-do stage. Each member should pull the assignment and add his or her name to it. So now let's get into how the development is done inside a Scrum team. So it's called Team Swarm, and let's start by saying what it is not. So it's not a mini waterfall inside the iteration, which a lot of time people assume how they go about it. It's more like a group. So you might have one single team working one story to the next story to the next story, or you might subdivide the team, let's say in pairs, or 3 or 4 person each, who are working in parallel, so like a teamlets that are parallel working on multiple stories. So generally there is one assigned coordinator who is in charge of the story, and there would be the others who are the workers, the swarmers. Now coordinator is in charge of the story being worked upon to ensure the done state is attained, and each story should have only one coordinator, so one clear responsibility, while there can be multiple swarmers in the story. And a swarmer is a person who is moving from story to story, offering expertise and efforts, whatever it's needed, to bring it to the done state. Now let's go to the daily Scrum. So let's start by saying it's always 15 minutes. It's not going to go up or down. It can be less, but it shouldn't go up beyond 15 minutes, even if you have a little larger team size. So what do you do in this? So this has to be done daily and at a fixed time as agreed by the team, and everyone should be present there. In fact, some teams set ground rules like fining someone or certain criterias, certain punishment at times, to make sure everyone is present. The participants are the Scrum members, and the Scrum Master is the coordinator, it's the facilitator. And there's a concept called chickens and pigs. So basically, the ones who are totally committed to it, committed to the Scrum in getting the work done, are considered the pigs, and basically they're the one who are talking. The chickens are those who are involved, so it could be anywhere from product owner, other stakeholders. They do not participate, they do not talk, but they can observe during the activities. So every team member asks 3 key questions, or rather answers 3 key questions during the stand-up meeting, and they are: what did you do since the last Scrum, what task, what activity, etc. What are you going to do until the next Scrum meeting, which is generally the next 24 hours. What is stopping you, if there is any impediments, any difficulty that's not allowing you to do the things that you're supposed to do optimally. So what we talked about what it is, what stand-up meeting is, but let's talk about what it is not. So it's not a problem solving session. So If there is a impediment, you should just note it down and move on with it. It's not meant to be discussion sessions, because this is just more of updating each other so that there is a proper coordination between each other. If there's a problem that needs to be solved, that would have a separate meeting, and you don't want to waste everyone's time in that. It's not a way to collect information about who is behind on schedule, etc. It's more of just updating each other in a meeting in which team members make commitment to each other as well as to the Scrum Master. It's a good way for the Scrum Master to track the progress of the team and find out what he can work on to ensure the team makes better progress. Now, what he gets out of it, the Scrum Master, is an impediment log. So what is an impediment log? So as you can see in the diagram, there's the Scrum board, which has the stories to do, doing, and done. And there can be a smaller board beside it, which is basically the impediment log. So key things about impediment log is it should be made visible to everyone. So that's why putting it up and beside the board is a good step. And the job of the Scrum Master is to find the impediments, search for impediments. And sometimes you'll have a lot of them, so it's a matter of identifying. You can set like a limit, like in this case we are talking about setting it max 4. So at any point of time you're going to focus on 4 impediments only. And also to define the difference between local and global impediments, and help the team resolve impediments. So it shouldn't be always that the Scrum Master is the only one who's going to do it, but other times you can help the team try to solve their own problem. This is all working towards a self-managed state down the line. Now, before we go into talking about the sprint review and sprint retro, let's spend a little time on the definition of done. This is something that you define together with the product owner early in the game, and this is like a checklist of things that should be achieved per story before it can be considered as done. Because remember, in Agile, there's no value in a semi-finished output. It's either done or not. So it's a 0 or 1. So to be considered 1 or a completed state, there has to be a certain checklist that needs to be met. So this is, for example, example of definition of done state, like design has been done and reviewed, code completed, details of what is considered under code completed, end user documentation updated, tested in the different types of tests that goes under it, and 0 known defects, acceptance tested, etc. So this is like a list, and it can be different depending on what your product owner requires. Now let's look into the sprint review. So the team has worked throughout the sprint execution, and they have completed a set of stories, and they have reached at the end of the sprint, and this is when the team meets together with the product owner, and there might be other stakeholders who join in and present what has been done. So the input for the sprint review is, of course, the sprint goals, the backlog, and what has been produced, the output potentially shippable increments, and they demonstrate it, they go through it, they discuss it, and the output is basically update to the product backlog and maybe some of the new items or refinement to it. And then basically if there is any other updates that needs to go to the release plan. Now let's talk about velocity, which is an important element in a sprint. Basically, the number of stories that you expect to burn down, and how do you establish that? So obviously, the first sprint, there would be a lot of learning, lot of knowing each other, knowing how the environment is working, etc. So the impediments might be quite different. However, the theory is over 3 or so sprint, the team usually reaches the optimal velocity, which is something that they can continue on and hopefully reach a stable state to produce over extended period of time. So it's more like a average velocity that you establish over 3 sprints that becomes your target velocity moving forward. Now the last activity of the sprint is the sprint retrospective. What is that? So let's say you're getting started after the sprint planning with the sprint execution, and what are the things that you need to do? Well, one of the first element of Scrum would be to create a Scrum board. It's basically a visual radiator which kind of shows the different tasks and what stage they are in. The different lanes in the Scrum board needs to be defined, like to do, in progress, done. There might be other lanes added appropriately, like testing or design, depends on the team and how they want to go about it. But generally, at least the basic would be to do, progress, and done. And before that is the list of or the lane that represents all the sprint backlog items. You may define the shop floor according to the needs of the team and according to the done state. So the done state has to be defined with the product owner, and depending on what needs to be done in defining a complete done state, that would affect. Let's do a checklist of do's and don'ts in a sprint. So obviously, one of the key thing is a sprint is not shorter than 1 week and not longer than 4 weeks. So average ones are about 2 weeks long. You got to remember that, if you do very short sprint like 1 week, there's a lot more time wasted in the sprint planning, review, retro, etc. And if you do too long a sprint like 4 weeks, there are possible higher risk, like there might be certain things you're doing, the stories are not reaching the product owner and customer early enough, so there's a higher risk. So it's a balance that has to be achieved depending on how dynamic the product is and how fast things are changing in the environment. Now each of the stories are broken down into, let's say, task. Now the task duration is preferably around 5% of the sprint duration. So for example, if you're doing a 2-week sprint and the total duration is like 80 hours, the task should not be more than 5% of that. So shorter defined task reduces also the risk of continue on, like sometimes someone got stuck on a certain task and he or she is not making progress. So keeping it short ensures that it's visible if it is moving, and it can be, if there are some impediments, that can be identified quickly and worked upon by other members of the team if needed to ensure progress is being made. User functions and user stories that are broken down into tasks, yes, you should do that. Must be broken down by the team into smaller tasks as required by their engineering practice. Not to be assigned, but to be picked by each of the members and according to what they can do best and what is needed. Now, the priority of picking them up also depends on the priority set during the discussion. And to ensure that product backlog is totally flexible, but sprint backlog is totally inflexible, meaning once it started, you do not add more stories to it. You may add stories at the end in case you finish it and there is still some time left in the time box, but adding any additional story while the sprint is ongoing is a bad idea and is a recipe for disasters, should be avoided. I think with that we reach the end of this segment. A lot of this material came from this book called Essential Scrum. You can refer to it, and some of the images are from Google search. Thank you.